What would you do if the world had turned you out at 18, worked you thin for 4 hard years, and then offered you a whole country inn for the price of a loaf of bread? Emma Walker paid 2 shillings for the ruined house at the end of Renford Lane, and the parish laughed itself hoarse the day the deed changed hands. But what waited behind the locked door on the upper landing would silence every laughing mouth in the village before the season turned. Settle in by the fire. Stay close. Let us know where you're watching from tonight, because the story of the girl who bought a haunted inn for a coin is only just beginning, and the truth inside that room is worse and stranger than any rumor the villagers dared to tell. The coach set her down at the crossroads a mile short of Renford, and the driver did not tip his hat. Emma stepped into the wet November grass with her whole life bundled in a canvas sack. 2 mended dresses, a comb, a salter, a tin of dried lavender her mother had pressed the summer before the fever came. She was 22 years old and thinner than she had been at 18. The road ran between hedgerows blackened by rain, and somewhere beyond the hawthorn a rook called once and did not call again. She walked because there was no one to meet her. 4 years in service in a merchant's house in Bristol had left her with a folded paper of wages, a character reference she suspected the housekeeper had written out of pity, and a cough that came back whenever the coal smoke thickened. The merchant's wife had turned her out in October for the crime of refusing the merchant's son. Emma had not argued. She had packed her sack, taken her wages, and asked the cook for a heel of bread. The cook had given her a whole loaf and looked away. Renford lay in a shallow valley of stone and slate, a huddle of cottages around a squat grey church, a mill wheel turning slow in the beck, a market cross worn smooth by weather. Emma remembered it from childhood in fragments. A fair day, a ribbon, her father lifting her onto his shoulder to see the Morris dancers. Her father had been dead 9 years. Her mother had followed him when Emma was 14. The uncle who had taken her in had died bankrupt 4 years later, and the creditors had put her onto the road with a valise and a shilling. Renford had not been home for a long time. It was only the last place on earth she still remembered a kind face. She reached the village by dusk. Lamps were being lit in the windows of the Boar and Anchor. A dog barked once from a butcher's yard. Nobody looked up as she passed. At the far end of the lane, where the cobbles gave out into mud, stood the house she had come for. 3 stories of soot-blackened stone, a sagging slate roof, a hanging sign so faded she could not read what beast had once been painted on it. The windows were boarded. The door was chained. A crow sat on the chimney pot and watched her approach without moving. Emma set down her sack in the mud and looked up at the ruin she had come 3 counties to see, and something in her chest that had been braced for years finally let go and sat down. The advertisement had run in the county paper for 6 weeks before anyone answered it. Property, the Bell Inn, Renford, long shuttered. Sold as it stands, contents included, for the token sum of 2 shillings, purchaser to assume all outstanding parish rates. Emma had read it in a discarded broadsheet lining a fishmonger's crate, and she had cut it out with a paring knife and carried it in her bodice for a fortnight before she wrote to the solicitor. The solicitor's clerk, a spare man named Mr. Ackerley, met her at the door of a low office off the market square the next morning. He blinked at her worn dress and reddened hands as though a sparrow had flown in through his window. "You are the purchaser," he said. "I am," Emma replied. He laid the deed on the desk between them, and the ink was so black and the paper so heavy that for a moment she did not believe it was hers. She counted 2 shillings out of her wage packet. He counted them again. He gave her a great iron key on a length of tarred string and a smaller brass key wrapped in a scrap of oiled paper. "The great key is the front door," he said. "The brass key is for the upstairs room at the head of the landing. It has been kept locked since the last landlord died. I would advise you not to trouble yourself with it." Emma looked at him. "Why?" Mr. Ackerley's mouth worked once, as though he had swallowed something. "It is only advice," he said. "I have no authority in the matter. The house is yours entire." By noon, the word had gone round Renford that the Bell had been bought by a girl from nowhere for the price of a pint of ale, and by the time she walked back down the lane with the keys in her apron pocket, 3 men outside the Boar and Anchor were already laughing. One of them, a broad, red-faced man in a good coat, called out across the mud, "2 shillings for a ruin, miss. You've been robbed by the parish and don't know it yet." Emma did not turn her head. She walked on. "There's rot in every beam," the man called after her. "There's rats in the cellar the size of terriers, and there's a room upstairs no honest soul has opened in 11 years. You'll be back in Bristol by Christmas, girl, or in the churchyard." The laughter followed her all the way to the chained door. What would drive a young woman with nothing left to spend her last 2 shillings on a house the whole village had already condemned? What did the dead landlord lock away on the upper landing that even the solicitor would not name? And why, of all the ruins in England, did this one call her home? If this story has caught hold of you already, do leave a comment and tell us where you're listening from, and press the little bell to follow along, because we are about to step inside the Bell Inn with Emma Walker, and what she finds behind that brass-keyed door will unsettle every hearth in Renford. She stood at the chained door with the laughter still ringing behind her in the cold air, and for a long moment she did not put the key in the lock. She only looked at the wood. The paint had gone the color of wet ash. A wren had built once in the eaves above the lintel and left the small cup of its nest behind, tipped and empty. The hanging sign creaked on its iron. Emma pressed her palm flat against the door as one might steady a horse and felt the cold come up through her mended glove. Behind her, the village went on being a village. A woman with a basket of turnips crossed herself as she passed the mouth of the lane. 2 boys stopped their game to stare, then bolted when Emma turned her face. Somewhere further off, a cooper was hammering. The sound carried the way sounds carry in valleys, thin and clear, and made the silence around the bell feel deeper. She did not open the door yet. She walked once around the outside of the house instead, keeping close to the stone, laying her hand on it every few paces. Nettles had grown waist-high along the yard wall. A cracked water butt lay on its side. The stable had lost half its roof to a storm no one had mended. At the back, where the kitchen garden had been, brambles had swallowed the paths, and a single blackened apple hung from a tree that had otherwise given up its fruit to the birds. It was there, at the low gate to the kitchen yard, that the old woman spoke to her. Emma had not seen her come. She was small and bent inside a gray shawl, and she carried a bundle of kindling roped at her hip. Her eyes were very clear, the pale blue of well water in winter. She looked at Emma for a long time before she said anything, and Emma did not feel afraid, only held. "You are the girl who bought the bell," the old woman said. "I am." The old woman nodded once, as though something long expected had at last arrived. She looked past Emma at the upper story of the house, at the boarded window on the landing side, and her mouth moved as if counting. "The house has been waiting for a walker," she said. "Do not open the small door until the house asks." Emma did not know what to answer. "I do not understand you." "You will," the old woman said. "You will in a season or 2. She lifted her bundle higher on her hip, gave Emma a look that was not unkind, and went on down the muddy track toward the beck without turning back. Emma watched the gray shawl until it was gone behind a hedge, and only then did she notice that her own hand had closed hard around the great iron key in her pocket. She stood a moment more in the wet grass. A walker. She had not spoken her surname to anyone in Renford but Mr. Ackerley, and Mr. Ackerley had written it on the deed but not called it out. She turned the words over and could make nothing of them. The house has been waiting. She looked up at the boarded window on the landing, and the boarded window gave her nothing back. She was still standing there when the broad, red-faced man came round the corner of the lane on a good bay horse and drew up in the yard. He had followed her. He did not dismount. He sat above her with the reins slack, and he smiled the smile of a man who has never in his life been kept waiting. "Miss Walker, I believe," he said. Emma inclined her head half an inch. "Mr. Hollis," he said, "owner of most of what you see between the church and the mill. I thought I would come and pay my respects to the parish's newest landlady." He let the word hang so she would feel it. 2 shillings, my word. I have paid more for a bad dinner." "It is my house," Emma said. "So it is. So it is." He looked the front of the bell up and down, slow, and let his mouth work, as if tasting something poor. "I offered Ackerley £5 for this pile 3 winters back, and he would not shift it. Now a girl walks in from the coach road and he lets it go for 2 shillings and a promise on the parish rates." He laughed, one short breath. "There is no justice in law, miss, only fashion." He gathered his reins. "When you have had enough of the damp and the dark and the little brass key, you come to me. I shall give you 30 shillings for the deed and a seat on the carrier's cart back to wherever it is you came from. That is more kindness than you will find in this village, I promise you." Emma said nothing. Mr. Hollis touched his hat with 2 fingers, not in courtesy, but in dismissal, and turned the bay out of the yard. The horses' hooves rang once on the cobbles at the lane's head and were gone. Emma stood in the wet grass with the great iron key hot in her palm from how tightly she had held it, and she understood that she had been given a warning and an offer and a mockery all in a single breath, and that none of them would move her. She went back to the front door. The chain was rusted through in one link. A good pull broke it. The great iron key ground in the lock, resisted, and turned. The door came open with the sound of something reluctant waking. A wash of cold air met her, dry and old, smelling of soot and mice and the sweet dust of long-closed rooms. Emma stepped over the threshold of the Bell Inn for the first time, and the door shut behind her of its own weight, and she was inside. The light came only from where the boards had slipped on the front windows, in thin white bars across the flagged floor. She stood in a passage that had once been the tap-room's approach. A long counter ran along one wall, its edge worn shiny by 50 years of forearms. Behind the counter, shelves still held pewter tankards and a row of dark bottles, dusted gray. A settle by the cold hearth had lost one of its feet and leaned. A tin lantern hung from a nail above the door, unlit for 11 years, still full of tallow gone hard. Emma set her canvas sack on the counter. She took off her bonnet. She stood in the middle of the room and did not move for a long time, only listened. The house spoke as old houses do. A joist somewhere sighed. A shutter on the yard side tapped once, twice, against its frame in the wind. Water moved in a gutter above her, tracing a slow line she could hear but not see. She thought she heard a mouse, and then did not. Above her head, above the beamed ceiling, above the stairs she had not yet climbed, was the landing and the small door and the brass key in her apron. She did not go up. Instead, she opened her sack. She laid out her 2 mended dresses on the settle to keep them off the floor. She set the salter and the comb on the counter beside the pewter tankards. She took the tin of dried lavender from the bottom of the sack and opened it, and the small green summer smell of it went out into the cold room. And for the first time since Bristol she felt something in her chest that was not quite grief. That night she slept in her shawl on the settle, with the great iron key under her hand and the front door barred with a chair. She did not build a fire. She was too tired to gather wood, and she did not yet trust the chimney. She lay listening to the bell around her. The wind rose after midnight and pushed at the shutters, and somewhere upstairs a board creaked as though a foot had shifted on it, and then was still. Emma did not open her eyes. She only closed her fingers on the iron key and waited for the sound to come again. It did not. But near dawn, when the blue light began to gray the bars on the floor, she heard, quite distinctly, above her head, the sound of something small being set down on wood. Emma lay still until the light had turned from gray to the pale yellow of a cold morning, and then she rose. The settle had marked her shoulder. Her breath stood white in the room. She did not go to the stairs. She went instead to the front window and eased back one of the loose boards until she could see the lane, and there was no one on it, only a thrush turning leaves near the wall. She stood a long moment with her hand on the board. Above her, nothing moved. Whatever had been set down on wood had not been set down again. She built her first fire in the taproom hearth with a broken chair leg and a handful of straw from the stable, and she boiled water in a copper pan she found blackened on a shelf. The chimney drew after a wary minute of smoke. She drank the hot water plain, cupping it in both hands for the warmth, and she ate the last quarter of the cook's loaf. Then she took the great iron key from under her shawl and hung it on a nail by the door where she could see it, and she took the smaller brass key from her apron and looked at it for the length of one slow breath and put it back. She began that morning at the bottom. She swept the flagged floor with a bundle of birch twigs tied with twine, working from the far wall toward the door, and the dust rose in a gray column that hung in the light. She wiped the counter with a rag torn from the hem of her older dress. She counted the pewter tankards, 9. She counted the dark bottles on the shelf, 11. She did not know yet why she was counting. It was only that hands and eyes needed a task while the house learned her tread. It was as she was carrying the settle away from the hearth to sweep beneath it that she saw the first thing that did not fit. There was a beam above the tap room that ran the length of the room, blackened by smoke and by 50 years of tallow, and where it met the wall over the stairs it had been notched crookedly, as though a carpenter had cut for a joint that was never made. Into the notch, and only visible when she stood on the settle with a rag in her hand, someone had carved a wren. It was no bigger than her thumbnail. 2 lines for the tail, a dot for the eye. It had been done neatly, with a small blade, and then rubbed with soot so that it would not be seen unless a person was looking for it. Emma stood on the settle and stared at it. A wren in Renford over a stair. She thought of the empty nest above the lintel outside. She thought of the old woman at the gate. She climbed down. She did not go up the stairs, not yet. She only stood at the foot of them with her hand on the newel and looked up into the dim landing and listened, and heard nothing but the wind against the yard shutter. She said aloud, softly, to no one, "In a season or 2. Her own voice startled her. By afternoon, the cat had come. Emma did not know from where. She had propped the front door open with a stone to air the room, and when she turned from the counter there was a lean gray cat sitting on the flagstones inside the threshold, with its tail folded neatly around its front paws, looking at her as though it had been waiting a long time, and was not surprised she had finally arrived. It was old. One ear was notched. Its eyes were the color of the river under cloud. Emma set down the rag. She knelt slowly. The cat allowed her to touch the top of its head with 2 fingers and then walked past her into the tap room, sniffed the tin of lavender on the counter, and went to the foot of the stairs and sat facing up. It did not go up. It only sat and looked and waited. Emma watched it a long while. Then she took her rag again and went back to work. That evening she gathered wood from the fallen stable timbers, and she built her fire proper, and she ate a bowl of oats boiled with a little salt from a twist of paper the cook had put into her sack without her knowing. The cat ate a spoonful from the edge of the hearth. It slept curled against her hip on the settle, and Emma slept better for the small warm weight of it, and the board upstairs did not creak that night, or if it did, she did not hear it. In the morning she began on the windows. She pried the boards from the front room one at a time, careful of the leaded glass beneath, and the light came into the tap room for the first time in 11 years, cold and clean and full of dust. Under the boards on the sill she found a dried sprig of rosemary tied with a bit of red thread. She held it in her palm a moment before she set it on the counter beside her psalter. Rosemary for remembrance. She had learned that in a churchyard at 14. She worked. Her hands cracked and healed and cracked again. She scrubbed the flagstones with sand and lye water from a crock she found in the pantry, and she scoured the copper pans until they shone dull pink, and she took a broken shutter down and mended it with a length of leather from an old harness in the stable. The cat followed her at a distance of 5 paces. When she stopped, it stopped. When she knelt to a task, it settled a little way off and watched, blinking slowly. The clues came as her hands learned the house. On the underside of the counter, where a knee might rest, she found initials scratched into the wood, not 1 set but 3 in different hands, and the last was WW, cut deep and recent. Behind a warped panel in the pantry, when she pulled it back to check for damp, there was a small shelf that held a stack of ledger books, their covers foxed, their pages closed. She did not open them yet. She set them on the counter with the salter and the rosemary and the tin of lavender, and she went back to her scrubbing because her mind was not ready and her hands still were. On the fourth day she washed the passage that led to the stairs, and as she wrung out the rag she saw, low on the wainscot near the newel, a mark that was not damp and not soot. It was a line of small notches, cut into the wood at different heights, each with a letter beside it. ARTJW. The lowest was hardly a foot from the floor. The highest was higher than her own shoulder. She sat back on her heels with the wet rag in her hand. She knew what a mother did in a kitchen doorway with a knife and a growing child. She had seen it in the merchant's house, 4 notches for 4 sons. The cat came and pressed itself once, briefly, against her knee, and then went to the foot of the stairs and sat down and looked up into the dark, and Emma sat where she was on the wet flagstones for a long time and did not weep, though her eyes stung, and the wren over the stair was above her head all the while, unseen but not forgotten, and the brass key in her apron pocket had grown warm against her thigh from the work of the day. She washed her face at the pantry basin and dried it on her apron and went back to the counter where the ledgers waited. The cat came with her and sat at the corner of the counter with its tail folded. Emma opened the topmost book. The spine cracked softly, the way an old door does when a hand at last returns to it. The pages were columns of a landlord's accounts, kept in a careful, sloping hand. Barrels of ale received, hams smoked, hay bought, rooms let, a christening dinner in the spring of a year long past. She turned pages slowly. Names of Renford men she did not know, sums in shillings and pence, the price of candles, the price of a coffin. Near the back, the same hand had written a list of children with dates beside them, and at the top of the list, in a firmer stroke, a name, Walker. Her grandfather's Christian name she did not know, for her father had not spoken of him, but the surname sat there in ink the color of dried blood, and under it the names A.R.T.J.W., with dates spanning 15 years, and beside the last, in smaller letters, the word ours. Emma set the ledger down and put her hand flat upon it and did not move for a long moment. The cat watched her. She opened the second book. This one was thinner and the hand was different, rounder, a woman's. It began with a wedding date and a house, the bell, and it was a book of a landlady's small keeping. Linen mended, apples put down, a hen lost to a fox, a lodger's cough, a child's fever broken by mourning. The names of the children appeared again. The last child, W, was written of most often. He had liked bread with honey. He had learned his letters by the taproom fire. He had carved, one wet November, a wren over the stair, because his mother had told him the house was named for the little bird in the eaves, and he wished to sign it. Emma read the sentence twice. She looked up at the beam above the stairs, though she could not see the wren from where she stood, and then she looked down again. The third ledger was thinner still. Its entries were fewer and further apart, and the hand had grown unsteady. A fever in the village. 2 children buried in 1 week. Then a single line. My husband is gone into the earth this Michaelmas, and the boy W is all that is left me, and he is 15 years old, and the house is his. Then, a year on, in a hand so poor Emma had to lean into the light to read it. W has taken the coach for Bristol to seek work, for the rates are more than I can meet, and he says he will send what he can, and he says he will come back, and I have given him my father's psalter and a tin of lavender from the yard for the smell of home. Emma did not move for a long time. The cat rose and stepped onto the counter and lay along the length of the ledger with its chin on her wrist. Emma turned 1 more page. The last entry was in another hand entirely, a clerk's hand, dated 11 years back. The widow of this house being deceased, and no heir found within the parish, the premises are to be closed, and the small chamber above the landing sealed by her instruction, containing such effects as she wished kept for her son should he return. Emma took the smaller brass key from her apron. She held it in her open palm and looked at it as if she had never seen it before. Then she rose, and she took a tallow candle from the shelf and lit it at the hearth, and she went to the foot of the stairs. The cat went with her. She climbed slowly. Each stair sighed under her weight, and the candle threw her shadow long against the wall, and at the top of the flight was the landing, and at the head of the landing was the small door, and below her hand, low on the door frame, was one last notch, cut higher than the others, with the letter W beside it and no date. She fitted the brass key into the lock. It turned easily, as if it had been waiting. She pushed the door open, and the cold, shut air of 11 winters came out to meet her. Inside, in the first light of her candle, she saw a narrow bed made up with a quilt, a small table with a comb and a razor, a shelf of boys' books, a shirt folded on a chair, a pair of clean stockings, and a wooden chest at the foot of the bed. On the pillow, as though set down that morning, lay a bundle wrapped in linen. Emma stepped in. She set the candle on the table. She unwrapped the linen. Inside was another psalter, older than her own, with her father's name written on the flyleaf in a boy's careful hand, Walker, W., and beneath it, in a woman's writing, the words for my son when he comes home. She sat down on the bed without meaning to, and the ropes creaked, and she put the psalter to her mouth and pressed it there and did not weep, only breathed, and the cat came and set itself against her hip, and outside the small window that faced the yard, the light was the color of new tin, and a wind was beginning to rise. The wind rose all afternoon, and by dusk it was a gale off the moor. Emma had gone down to the tap room with the psalter in her hand and set it on the counter beside the ledgers and the rosemary and the tin of lavender, and she had stood there in the failing light and understood at last what she had bought for 2 shillings. She was not a stranger in this house. She was the last of it. Her father, who had died when she was 13, 9 years back, had been the boy who took the coach for Bristol and never came home. And this locked room had been his mother's slow patient waiting, kept made and kept clean by the will she had left with Ackerley, and Ackerley had kept faith with a dead woman for 11 winters, and the parish had laughed. Emma laid her hand on the counter where WW had been cut deep and recent, and she knew now whose knife had cut it, and she knew now why the old woman at the gate had said the house had been waiting for a walker. Then the storm broke over Renford. Rain came in sheets against the leaded glass, and a shutter tore on the yard side and beat itself to splinters against the wall, and the chimney howled, and somewhere down the lane a tree came down with a sound like a cart overturning. Emma stood at the door with the great iron key in her hand. She thought of the small room upstairs, made up and dry, and of the tap room with its fire, and of the road outside where no one should be on such a night. She lifted the bar and looked out into the black wet. At first there was nothing, only rain on stone. Then she heard, faintly, under the wind, a voice, not a shout but a call, thin and used up. She took the tin lantern from its nail, lit it at the hearth, wrapped her shawl over her head, and went out into the lane. The cat did not follow. The cat sat on the counter beside the ledgers and watched her go. She found them 100 paces down the lane at the mouth of the beck, a carter's wife on foot with a shawl over an infant, and a boy of perhaps 6 clinging to her skirts, and behind them the carter himself sat in the mud beside a broken wheel and a horse standing patient in the rain. The woman was past speaking. The child was blue about the mouth. Emma held up the lantern and said, "The bell, come." The woman only stared. Emma took the infant from her arms without asking, tucked it under her own shawl against her body, and turned back toward the light of her open door. The woman followed. The boy followed the woman. The carter got himself up on one leg and hobbled after, leading the horse. Emma brought them into the tap room, closed the door against the wind, and barred it. She put the infant on the settle beside the fire, and stripped its wet wrappings, and dried it with the hem of her second dress, and wrapped it in the quilt she fetched down from the small room upstairs, the quilt from the made bed that had waited 11 winters for a son who did not come. And she laid the child on it before the hearth. She sat the woman on the settle, and put the copper pan over the fire, and boiled water, and gave her hot water with a pinch of salt, because there was nothing else. She brought the boy in and set him on the flagstones by the fire and rubbed his hands between her own until he cried, which was good, because it meant he could feel them. She went out again with the lantern for the carter and got him under his arm and brought him in and got his coat off him and sat him on the floor with his back to the settle. She put the horse in what was left of the stable and threw her cloak over its withers and came back drenched to the bone. In the tap room, the woman was weeping now, quietly, into the sleeping infant's hair, and the boy had fallen asleep against his father's leg, and the carter was looking about him at the swept flagstones and the shining pans and the ledgers on the counter and the psalter beside them, and he said low, "God bless the house." Emma sat down on the hearth and put her hands over her face for one moment only, and then she took them down and put more wood on the fire. And outside the storm went on, and inside the Bell Inn, for the first time in 11 winters, 5 people slept under its roof, and the cat lay across the topmost ledger with its chin on her father's name, and Emma, who had come 3 counties with a tin of lavender because her mother had pressed it the summer before the fever, understood that she had chosen and that she would not sell, not for 30 shillings, not for 30 pound, not for anything Mr. Hollis or any man could put upon the counter because the house had asked and she had answered, and the small door at the head of the landing stood open at last, and the wren above the stair was no longer hidden. The storm blew itself out before dawn, and the morning came in washed and pale over Renford, with slates shining and the beck run brown at the ford. The carter's wife slept still on the settle with the infant at her breast, and the boy was eating bread at the hearth as though he had never eaten bread before. Word travelled up the lane before the sun was properly above the churchyard yews. A woman with a basket of eggs came first, because the carter was her cousin's cousin, and she stood in the doorway of the Bell Inn, with her mouth a little open at the swept flags and the fire, and the girl in the mended dress pouring hot water. She set the eggs on the counter without a word and went out again. The cooper came next with a length of oak for the shutter, and the miller's boy with a sack of oats, and the vicar with nothing in his hands but his hat, which he held before him as he stepped over the threshold. The vicar was an old man, spare and quiet, and he looked a long time at the ledgers on the counter and at the psalter beside them, and at the fly-leaf where the name Walker, W., was written in a boy's careful hand. He turned to Emma and said, "I buried his mother." Emma said, "I know." He said, "She left instruction. Ackerley kept it." Emma said, "He did." The vicar set his hand once, lightly, on the topmost ledger, above the cat, and murmured, "She waited well." Then he went out to speak to the carter about a cart. Ackerley came at noon on foot with a leather case under his arm. He stood in the tap room and looked about him as though he had not been inside the house in 11 winters, which he had not. He opened the case on the counter and took out a folded parchment tied with faded tape. "The widow's will," he said, "kept sealed by her word, to be opened when a walker returned." He undid the tape with fingers that were not quite steady and read the clauses in his dry clerk's voice. The house, its contents, the yard, the stable, the kitchen garden, and such small moneys as remained after the parish rates, all to the child of her son W., should such a child come. He looked up over the parchment at Emma. "I kept faith," he said. Emma said, "You did." He said, "I could not tell you before the door was opened." That was her word also. Emma nodded, and the clerk folded the parchment carefully and left it on the counter with the ledgers. By afternoon, Mr. Hollis rode up on his good bay horse, and did not, this time, keep to the saddle. He came into the tap-room with his hat in his hand, which no one in Renford had seen before, and he stood a long minute looking at the swept floor and the mended shutter and the pans and the sleeping infant. He said, at last, "I did not know whose house it was." Emma said, "Neither did I." He said, 30 shillings was ill-spoken. Emma said, "It is forgotten." He put his hat back on at the door and went out to his horse and rode away slowly, and the villagers who had gathered in the lane parted for him without laughter, and closed again behind him without laughter, and looked instead at the open door of the Bell Inn, where a fire was burning that had not burned in 11 winters, and the sign above creaked on its iron as though it were trying at last to remember its own name. That evening, Emma went out with a rag and a little pot of linseed oil and cleaned the hanging sign until the painted bird beneath the soot came up faint but plain. A wren, wings folded, I a single dark dot, exactly the bird carved above the stair. The villagers who passed took off their caps to it, and to her, and went on. A week later the sign had been repainted by the cooper's son for the price of a supper, and the Bell Inn took in its first paying travelers since the widow's time. 2 drovers off the Bristol road, who ate mutton at the scrubbed counter and paid in copper and slept in clean beds upstairs. The carter's wife came back with her infant to help with the linen, and the boy of perhaps 6 ran errands to the mill for a farthing a day. The old woman in the grey shawl passed the yard gate once more and stopped and looked at Emma and said only, "The house asked," and went on toward the beck without turning her head. Emma stood that evening in the tap-room doorway at golden hour, with the light long and yellow across the flagstones and the wren on the sign turning gently on its iron. The cat sat at her boot. Behind her the fire burned steady, and the small door at the head of the landing stood open, and a lamp was lit in the room that had been made and kept for a son who did not come, and made and kept, in the end, for his daughter. Emma laid her reddened hand on the doorpost where the notches were cut, at A and R and T and J and W, and then, a little higher, where she had that morning cut one more with the paring knife she had carried from Bristol, and the letter E beside it. She said quietly to no one and to the house both, "I did not buy an inn. I came home." Thank you for staying to the end of this one, for sitting with Emma through the cold and the candlelight and the long patience of a house that waited. If the quiet homecoming of the Bell moved you, leave a kind word below, tap the like, and follow along, for next time, a young widow inherits a shuttered lighthouse on the Cornish coast, and what the keeper left behind in the lamp room will change the village forever. Until then, be well, and be gentle with the small doors in your own keeping.